Hello, my dears. Come, sit with an old woman for a spell. I want to tell you a story. Not one from a book or some fanciful tale, but a true story that happened in this very house. A story that carved lines on my heart as deep as the ones you see on my face. It's about the day the scales fell from my eyes, and I saw my own family for who they truly were. You see, I had just returned from a 2-week trip to visit my sister, Agatha, up in the mountains. The air there is so clean it hurts your lungs, but it's a good hurt. I was full of stories and peace, my suitcase stuffed with little trinkets for my grandchildren. My son, David, and his wife, Chloe, had insisted on picking me up from the station. "Don't you dare take a taxi, Mum," David had said over the phone. "We'll be there." I remember feeling so warmed by that. My boy always so thoughtful. But when I stepped through my own front door, the air wasn't full of welcome. It was thick with a silence that felt wrong. The first thing I saw was my daughter, my sweet Amelia. She was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Her face was buried in her hands, and she looked so small, so broken, like a little girl who'd lost her favorite doll. My heart cracked right then and there. "Amelia? My darling, what is it?" But before she could even look up, a wave of laughter rolled in from the living room. Loud, boisterous, familiar laughter. It was my son David and his in-laws Brenda and Frank. They were clinking glasses of what looked like my good sherry, the one I saved for Christmas. David was slapping his knee, telling some story, his face flushed with merriment. The contrast was so violent, so cruel, it stole the breath from my lungs. Here was my daughter, shattered into 1,000 pieces on the stairs, and not 10 feet away, her own brother was laughing it up as if it were a birthday party. I didn't say a word. Not then. An old woman learns the power of silence. I helped Amelia up, led her into the kitchen, away from that dreadful noise, and made her a strong cup of sweet tea. Her hands were trembling so badly the spoon rattled against the mug. "Now, my child," I said, my voice low and steady, "you tell me everything." And she did. Oh, my dears, she did. It all came tumbling out. While I was away, breathing mountain air and feeling carefree, a viper had been let loose in my nest. David and Chloe, with Brenda and Frank cheering them on, had been systematically pressuring Amelia. You see, after her father passed, he left this house to me, but with the understanding that it would be a home for both my children, for as long as they needed. But David and Chloe had decided they wanted more. They wanted to sell this old place, this house filled with a lifetime of memories, and use the money to buy a modern soulless box in some new development. They presented Amelia with a fait accompli. They'd already spoken to an estate agent. They'd drawn up figures. They told her it was for the best, that she could use her share to get a small flat. Amelia, who has the softest heart of anyone I know, was devastated. This isn't just a house to her. It's her sanctuary. It's where she grew up, where she remembers her father. She tried to reason with them, to beg for time, but they just laughed it off, called her sentimental and foolish. The laughter I heard when I walked in? That was them toasting their brilliant plan, while my daughter's world was crumbling around her. A cold fury began to simmer in my old bones. It was a slow, deep burn, the kind that comes from a betrayal you never saw coming. I waited until the sherry was finished and the mood in the living room was jovial. Then I walked in. I didn't storm. I glided. There's a power in moving slowly when everyone expects a storm. "David, Chloe," I said, my voice sweet as honey. "Brenda, Frank. So lovely of you to make yourselves at home." David grinned, a little tipsy. "Mom, come have a drink. We were just celebrating." "Celebrating?" I asked, tilting my head. "What, pray tell, is the occasion?" He exchanged a quick, nervous glance with Chloe. "Well, we've just had some very productive talks about the future. The family's future. The future of this family," I repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "How interesting. You see, I was just in the kitchen speaking with the other half of this family. My daughter. The one you reduced to tears with your productive talks." The room went dead silent. Brenda had the decency to look at her shoes. David sputtered. Mom, she's being emotional. She doesn't see the opportunity here. We need to be practical. Practical. I let out a soft, mirthless laugh. You think betraying your sister's trust and trying to sell her home out from under her is practical? You think greed is a substitute for love? I walked over to the mantelpiece and picked up a small, tarnished silver bell that belonged to my mother. You all seem to have forgotten something very important. This is my house. My name is on the deed. My life is in these walls. And I am not dead yet. I looked my son straight in the eye, and for the first time I saw not my little boy but a stranger. David, you have shown me a side of you I hope never to see. You were raised with values, with love, and you have traded them for a quick profit and the approval of your in-laws. I turned to Brenda and Frank. And you too. You encouraged this. You fed this poison. You are guests in my home, and you thought you could orchestrate its demise. I think it's time for you to leave. There was a flurry of protests of how dare yous, and we were only tryings. But I just stood there holding my mother's bell, a rock in a stormy sea. Finally, shamed and angry, they left. David and Chloe stood there defiant. You're choosing her over us? David accused. No, David, I said, my voice finally breaking with the weight of it all. I am choosing what is right over what is easy. I am choosing the child who protects the heart of this family over the one who would pawn it for cash. Until you can remember what that heart is, the one your father and I tried to give you, this house is no longer your home. The silence after they slammed the door was louder than any laughter. I walked back to the kitchen where Amelia was still sitting, her tears now dried. She looked at me, her eyes full of a pain I couldn't fully take away. That was 6 months ago, my dears. The dust has settled, but the landscape of our family is forever changed. David and I speak, but it's strained, a conversation over a crack too wide to mend easily. Some fractures go too deep. But this story isn't just about a broken heart. It's about a heart that was rediscovered. Amelia and I, we live here together now. We've planted a new garden in the back. She paints in the sunroom, and the sound of her laughter is slowly returning, filling the spaces that were once so empty. The moral of my story? Don't wait for a crisis to know who your people are. Watch how they behave when they think no one is looking. Watch how they treat the most vulnerable among you. And never, ever underestimate an old granny. We have seen storms you cannot imagine, and we know how to stand our ground. We are the keepers of the stories, and the guardians of the hearth. And this hearth, my dears, will keep burning for the one who truly understands its warmth. In the weeks that followed, the house felt both lighter and heavier. The poison was gone, but the silence it left behind was a new kind of presence. Amelia and I moved around each other like gentle ghosts, tending to the garden and drinking tea on the porch. We were healing, but we were also avoiding the great, gaping hole where a son and a brother used to be. It was on a rainy Tuesday that I decided to face the attic. An old woman's attic is a map of her life, and mine was full of landmarks I'd been too cowardly to visit. Dust motes danced in the slants of light from the single bare bulb. And there it was, pushed against the far wall under a yellowing sheet, your grandfather Arthur's old sea trunk. He'd left it to me when he passed with a specific instruction. Eleanor, don't you go opening this until you truly need a reminder of what matters. I'd never felt needy enough to disturb it. Until now. The lock was stiff, but it gave way with a groan that sounded like a sigh from the past. Inside, it wasn't filled with treasure. Not the kind David would understand. No, it was filled with my Arthur. His old fishing logs, bundles of my letters tied with faded ribbon, and at the very bottom a thick leather-bound journal. I sat on the dusty floorboards, my knees protesting, and I opened it. And my dears, I heard his voice as clear as if he were sitting beside me. His words weren't just a reminder. They were a roadmap. Meanwhile, David was not idle. I heard through Agatha, who heard from her friend Betty, whose daughter knows Chloe's cousin. Well, you know how the grapevine works. David and Chloe had moved in temporarily with Brenda and Frank. And from what I gathered, the celebratory mood had soured. Brenda, it seemed, was a woman used to being the queen of her own castle, And having a dethroned prince and his wife under her roof was not the same as having them as guests. The pressure was building in their house, just as it had released in mine. It was a Thursday afternoon when the knock came. Not a timid tap, but a firm, official-sounding rap. Amelia looked at me, her eyes wide with a fear I knew too well. Had David found a way to force the sale? Was it a lawyer? I opened the door to find a well-dressed man with a briefcase, but he wasn't a lawyer. He was Mr. Albright, the executor of Arthur's will, a will we had settled years ago. "Mrs. Eleanor," he said, looking uncomfortable, "I do apologize for the intrusion, but a matter has come to light. A supplementary instruction from your husband pertaining to a specific asset. May I come in?" "Over tea," Mr. Albright explained. Arthur, in his infinite secretive wisdom, had not left me just this house. Tucked away on the edge of the county, forgotten by everyone including me, was a single acre of woodland. It was land everyone had overlooked, including the lawyers who drew up the main will. Arthur's journal had a single cryptic line about it. "For the child who sees the forest, not the lumber." The instruction was that its existence was only to be revealed if the family's stability was ever threatened. The land itself wasn't immensely valuable, but a new railway line was being proposed, and its route went right along the edge of that very acre. Suddenly, this forgotten patch of earth was worth a very pretty penny, and the moral dilemma Arthur had left me was breathtaking. Do I use it to secure mine and Amelia's future? Do I split it, as the world would expect, with David rewarding his behavior? Or did Arthur's words, "the child who sees the forest," point to a different path entirely? The news, as such news always does, leaked out. My phone rang 2 days later. It was David. His voice wasn't angry or demanding. It was strained, tired. "Mom," he said, "can we talk? Not about the house. Not about anything. Just talk." I agreed to meet him at the park on neutral ground. The boy who arrived looked older. The confidence he'd had with his in-laws was gone, replaced by a nervous energy. Over a bench seat, David unburdened himself. Life at Brenda and Frank's was a nightmare of passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled resentment. Chloe, he confessed, was miserable, and their marriage was feeling the strain. The grand plan had crumbled, and he was left holding the pieces of a life he no longer recognized. He didn't ask for the land. He didn't ask for anything. He just said, I think I made a terrible mistake, Mom." And for the first time it sounded like a confession, not an excuse. I listened. I didn't offer solutions. I simply asked him one question, the question his father had left for me. "David," I said, "if I showed you a forest, what would you see?" He looked confused, then thoughtful. He started talking about development potential, then stopped himself. He looked at the trees in the park and finally said, "I think I'd see a place that was here long before me, and will be here long after." It wasn't Amelia's answer. She would have spoken of the beauty and the life within it, but it was a start. It was the first flicker of seeing the forest and not just the lumber. When I told Amelia about the meeting, and about the forgotten acre, her reaction surprised me. She wasn't excited about the money. She was hurt that I had met with David without her. "You're negotiating with him after everything," she said, her voice trembling. The betrayal she felt was now directed at me. The foundation we had built was cracking under this new pressure. I had been so focused on David's journey, I had neglected the heart I was sworn to protect. That night, I took Arthur's journal to Amelia's room. I didn't speak. I simply handed it to her, open to the page about the forest and the lumber. I left her alone with her father's words. An hour later she came downstairs, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. She hugged me, a deep, forgiving hug. "He knew, didn't he?" she whispered. "He knew David would need to find his way back. Arthur, even from the past, was still teaching us how to be a family." With the family on slightly more stable, if still fragile ground, I made a decision. I called a family meeting. Not in the living room with its bad memories, but in the garden. David came alone. I laid out Arthur's final puzzle and the value of the land. And then I made my proposal. We would not sell the acre. Instead, we would use a small portion of its value as a loan to help David and Chloe get a starter home of their own, on the condition they attended marriage counseling. The rest would be placed in a trust for the grandchildren's education. The land itself, the forest, would remain untouched as Arthur wished. David cried. My strong, proud boy, who had laughed while his sister cried, now had tears streaming down his face. It wasn't the grand fortune he might have dreamed of, but it was a lifeline. It was a chance to build something for himself, without Brenda and Frank's shadow, and to save his marriage. More importantly, it was a lesson in humility and conditional grace. He looked at Amelia and said, I'm so sorry. For all of it. And for the first time she nodded a silent, tentative acceptance. The paperwork was signed. David and Chloe found a small terraced house on the other side of town. It was a fresh start. Amelia started using some of the trust money to take art classes, her passion rekindled. And one weekend we all went to see that forgotten acre. We didn't talk about money or railways. We just walked through the dappled sunlight, listening to the birds. David pointed out a particularly old oak tree. Amelia sketched it. We were tentatively a family again. Different, scarred, but rooted. So you see, my dears, a family is like this old house. Sometimes the foundations shake. Sometimes rot sets in and you have to cut it out, which is a painful, painful business. But if the core structure is sound, if it was built with love and strong timber, it can withstand the storm. The rooms may be rearranged, the paint may change color, but it remains a home. Arthur didn't leave us wealth. He left us wisdom. He knew that the greatest inheritance isn't land or money, but the strength to forgive, the courage to set boundaries, and the wisdom to know that some things, like a forest and a family's love, are worth more than their weight in gold. This old granny is still the keeper of this hearth. And my dears, the fire burns warm once more. The first true test of our fragile new peace was Christmas. For years, the house had echoed with a quiet sadness during the holidays. But this year Amelia insisted we try. We can't let what happened dictate all our future Christmases, Granny, she said, her voice firm with a newfound strength. David and Chloe arrived, holding a carefully made pudding and looking as nervous as kittens. The air was thick with unspoken words at first, but the scent of pine and roasting turkey has a magic of its own. We didn't exchange grand gifts. We exchanged time. And when David, without being asked, fixed the wobbly leg on the old dining table, I knew it was his silent way of trying to mend what he had broken. In January, a bitter wind brought more than just frost. Brenda, Chloe's mother, showed up on my doorstep. Alone. She wasn't her usual brash self. She was subdued, her eyes avoiding mine. She came not to fight, but to apologize. The failure of their plan and seeing the near destruction of David and Chloe's marriage had shaken her. I thought I was helping them get ahead, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I only taught my daughter to want more. I never taught her to be happy with what she has. It wasn't a full redemption, but it was a start. I offered her tea, not as friends, but as two old women who had learned a hard lesson about interference. With the trust fund securing her future, Amelia truly began to blossom. She turned the sunroom into a proper studio. Her paintings, once timid and muted, exploded with color and confidence. She started selling them at a local gallery, not for a fortune, but for the joy of it. One painting, a beautiful depiction of our garden with the old oak tree from the forgotten acre in the background, she gave to David and Chloe as a housewarming gift. It was a symbol, a flag of truce planted firmly in the soil of their new home. He hung it in their living room right above the fireplace. Inspired by my find, David asked if he could help me properly sort the attic. It was his way of reconnecting with his past, with his father. Together we found a small tin box with my name on it, tucked inside an old cradle. Inside were not my things but Arthur's. His father's pocket watch, a medal from his own father, and a stack of old shares in a company that no longer existed. But amongst them was a faded photo of Arthur and a young David, building a birdhouse together. David held that photo for a long, long time. I'd forgotten that, he said, his voice thick. He was remembering the man his father was, and in doing so, remembering the man he wanted to be. Chloe, freed from her mother's overwhelming shadow, began to find her own voice. She started a small community vegetable garden in the patch of land behind their new terrace, inviting neighbors to join. It was a world away from Brenda's ambitions of luxury. She brought us fresh tomatoes and cucumbers one weekend, her hands dirty, her smile genuine. David's building the raised beds, she said, with a pride I'd never heard in her voice before. They were building a life together from the ground up. One evening, Amelia was struggling with a large canvas, a depiction of our family's story. She was frustrated, feeling she couldn't capture the emotion. I sat with her and told her stories of Arthur, not just the good times but the hard times, the financial struggles, the disagreements, the deep, abiding love that saw us through. I realized then that my role had evolved. I was no longer just the matriarch holding the family together. I was the storyteller, the keeper of the memories. My stories were the pigments she needed for her art, the lessons David needed for his life. Life isn't a storybook with a neat happily ever after. David and Amelia will still have disagreements. Brenda will sometimes backslide into her old ways. There will be new challenges, new storms. But as I sit here in my armchair, watching the sunset paint the sky, I feel a profound peace. The hearth is warm. The family is no longer a brittle structure on the verge of collapse, but a living, breathing, resilient entity. My work as the primary keeper is not over, but the burden is lighter, shared now by all of us. The path ahead isn't perfectly clear, but for the first time in years we are walking it together, tending to the forest and to each other. And that, my dears, is the greatest story an old granny could ever hope to tell.